Welcome back to my channel. Today I have 3 new Easter DIYs for you. For the first DIY, I'm taking this Easter sign from the Dollar Tree, and it looks okay, but to me it looks a little blah with the background and the frame. But I do really like this middle portion of the sign, so I'm just going to go ahead and remove all of the paper from the frame. And I replace it with this black and white buffalo check scrapbook paper from Hobby Lobby. And I mark out where I need to cut the paper just by using my fingers to push along the inside edge of the frame. I use Waverly chalk paint in the color ink to paint the outside of the frame. Going in with a makeup sponge and that same color ink, I just lightly tap along the outside edge of this inner sign. It's a really good idea to tap off some of that color on your sponge before you apply it to the sign. I really wanted to upgrade the look of the sign and bring more continuity with the color. In my opinion, painting the frame black to match the ink of this inner sign looks much better. You can really see how the black around the outside edge makes this sign stand out even more. I go around the border a second time to deepen up that color and bring it into the sign a little bit more. I use Mod Podge to attach the paper to the sign. It does dry very quickly, so it's best to work in small sections so you can work out any air bubbles as you go. Anything worth doing is worth doing right. I've seen so many tutorials out there where they just don't take the time to work all of the air bubbles out, and in my opinion, that does not look good and it really detracts from the look of the piece. Now I'm going in with some gray paint. I also do go in with a brown paint, which you'll see at the end, and maybe a little bit of black, and I'm just lightly going over the lines that are already there. I do create my own as well. This makes it look more like an authentic wooden piece. Because this sign is made of a glossy paper, you can easily wipe any mistakes off while it's still wet. Here's a look at the sign, and I think the detail that I've added makes it look like a rustic wood sign. To finish the piece, you just need to glue the sign in place and add a hanger to the back if you want. I think the changes give the sign a more neutral Easter look that stands out quite a bit more and would look great with any farmhouse decor. For project number 2, I'm going to use this bunny head wreath from the Dollar Tree, and I'm taking some chenille yarn. This is the big ball size from Michaels, and I did not even use a full skein of it. You'll see how much I have left over at the end. I just wrapped the tail around some of the inner wire. It will be covered anyway. You could also glue it to the frame if you like. I did not use a lot of glue for this project because I found that when you wrap this yarn and keep it nice and snug, you really don't have a need to glue it in place. There may be some areas where you want to make some adjustments, but for the most part, I did not use much glue for this project. You don't need to do what I'm doing here, which is using the full skein of yarn and pulling it through the areas each time. It is a pain in the butt, but it was really important to me at the time to use one piece of yarn rather than having smaller pieces of yarn that you have to glue onto the frame. Because the yarn is so thick and fluffy, you shouldn't be able to tell where you glued on additional pieces if you hide them well, but I just felt like using one piece. As I wrap the yarn, I'm keeping it really snug and tight. When you get to the ears, you're just going to start inserting the yarn through each bunny ear, as well as the center between the ears. To wrap the ears, I decided to weave it through the middle of the ear. I wrap the yarn around the left edge, go through the middle of the ear, and then wrap it around the right edge. You could also weave it around the outside of the ear. You will have to use a lot more glue to hold it in place, and I just think weaving it through the ear gives it a more interesting look. When you finish the ear, you just cut the yarn off and glue it into place. I used Fabri-Tac glue and tucked that tail in so that you can't see where it is. Make any adjustments to the yarn and glue it in place if there are any bare areas. But if you keep the yarn snug when you're wrapping it, you really shouldn't have many areas that need to be glued. Here's the yarn I have left over from one skein, so you do have quite a bit to work with. I found this ribbon at Walmart and I really like it. It is very stiff, which can make it difficult to work with. Full disclosure, I am not a bow maker. I am terrible at it, so you probably will never see me make anything but a very simple bow. I'm sure there are plenty of tutorials on YouTube that show how to make a proper bow. I'm always happy to get through it. For me, making a bow is about as enjoyable as painting eyes, which means it's not at all enjoyable for me. I made a very simple hanger by taking a pipe cleaner, twisting it at the bottom, and gluing it to the back of the bunny. Here's a look at the finished project. Now my bow is a little messy there. I should have straightened it up for a final view, but I didn't. Using a black and white ribbon makes this a nice neutral decor piece. For project number 3, I'm taking this Let It Snow sign from the Dollar Tree. I like that the grooves are already in it, so I've just removed the hanger and I'm going to fill in the holes using some spackle. Of course, being from Dollar Tree, there was a bunch of glitter over each of the letters, so I just took a paper towel and was able to wipe most of it off. I do go over it with a little bit of fine grit sanding paper just to make sure it was all removed. But it came off really easy for this particular sign. I give the sign a base coat of white Waverly chalk paint, and I ended up having to do 3 or possibly even 4 coats just to cover up that dark blue. I used 4 bunny ornaments from the Dollar Tree. 2 of them will be covered with the same scrapbook paper that I used in my first project, and I paint the other 2. I use Mod Podge to attach the scrapbook paper to 2 of the bunnies. And I'm just pressing that scrapbook paper on, making sure it's down good and firm so I don't have any air bubbles or loose edges. I paint 2 of the bunnies using ink chalk paint. I forgot to fill in the hole at the top. I did fill it in with spackle. I don't know why, but I almost always forget to fill it in until after I've started painting. Use an X-Acto knife to cut the scrapbook paper around the other 2 bunnies. I do sand along the edges of the bunnies with the scrapbook paper. I did not do that for my painted bunnies. I decided to use some pom-poms from the Dollar Tree for my little bunny tails, and I'm using some very thin ribbon to make bows for each of them. I started off with all of them having a white bow, but I end up changing that later in the project. This is likely one of the only times you'll see me making a bow is when it's just a really simple bow with thin ribbon. So the two black bunnies are going to have white bows, and you'll see me put a white bow on the scrapbook paper bunny here, but I do change that. Using pencil lead is a very easy way to distress a sign. And you can't really see it very clearly here because it's very light. I start out very light, and I'm just going around the whole sign, the edges as well as the middle, and adding some distressing marks. I started painting the seams using the black ink chalk paint, but I really didn't like it. It seemed a little too stark to me, so I ended up changing to melted chocolate brown from Apple Barrel Paints and mixed it in with some water. That made it much easier to apply, and I really like the look of the brown much better. I want some of that brown to go outside of the crease, so that does look like an aged sign. With a sponge brush, I'm going to apply more of that brown paint to the edges as well as the front of the sign, and I'm just going in really lightly, just bringing some of that color down from the edge. So after you've put a little bit of paint on your brush, it's probably a good idea to tap it off a little bit on a paper towel so that you can better control where the paint goes on your sign. And I'm just pulling it inward on the edges. I do add a lot more distressing than what I show you, and you'll see how nice it looks at the end. I don't think you guys want to watch me distress a sign for an hour. I go in with that sponge brush into the cracks and I pull that brown color out a little bit on the front of the sign. In my opinion, distressing looks a lot better when you do it in layers. So at the end, you'll see that I do have different layers of color mixed together, and it gives a really nice antique look. And now you can really start seeing some of that distressing along the front of the sign. I go in with the color mineral as well as that brown and just lightly add some distressing marks all over the front of the sign. I wanted the distressing to look really light and subtle on this piece. I think it's really easy to get carried away with some of the distressing using the brown, and I really didn't want that look for this piece. Just take your time and go on really lightly with each color. It's time to add the bunnies, so I glue the tails on each of them. And I found these letters at Walmart. They're a foam sticker letter, and I really liked how they looked. I loved the simplicity of it. Unfortunately, each set only has one capital T, and I really didn't want that small T on trail. I think it just doesn't look right. So I had to purchase 2 packets of the sticker letters just to spell out the bunny trail using capital letters. Using these little carrots from the Dollar Tree, I did the same thing that I did with the bunnies. I covered 2 of them with that same scrapbook paper, and then I painted 2 of them and just added some small little polka dots. I glued 2 of them to each upper corner of the sign. And here's where I decided to change the bows on the bunny. I was going to put a black and white ribbon on these, but then I decided just black looked better. It makes it stand out a little bit more on the scrap paper bunnies. I make sure each of them is placed about the same width apart and centered on the sign before I glue them down. Here's a final look at the sign. I did drill 2 holes at the top and added a wire hanger. I really like how the distressing turned out on the sign. I hope you enjoyed these projects. Please let me know in the comments below which one was your favorite. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next video. For project number 1, we're going to be using this wood grain scrapbook paper from Hobby Lobby. And I'm also using a tabletop sign from Dollar Tree, and I'm just going to cover the sides and back with that scrapbook paper. Now, because the tabletop sign is longer than my scrapbook paper, I do have to do a little splicing here, but you can get it to look very seamless so that it looks just like one long piece of paper. So I'm just marking out where I need to cut the next piece of paper. I use Mod Podge to glue it on. Off camera, I use some fine grit sanding paper, and I just go over all of the scrapbook paper very lightly to give it an even more weathered look. You'll see that a bit later in the video. I gave the front of the sign a couple of coats of Waverly chalk paint in the color Ivory. I also did some dry brushing with the color Truffle. I'm using reusable stencil stickers from Walmart to spell out the words chocolate bunnies. I thought it would be cute to make 3 different bunnies: white chocolate, milk chocolate, and dark chocolate. So I'm just starting at the middle point of the sign, and if you spell out chocolate bunnies with a space in between, the E of chocolate is the middle letter. So I start with that at the center of my sign, and then I work to the left just to make sure that I'm going to have enough room on the sign and my letters are centered on the sign appropriately. I use chalk paint in the color Truffle to add the letters, and I do end up going over the whole front of the sign with some fine grit sanding paper. Once I have some of the letters attached to the left, I go ahead and start adding my letters to the right of the center of the sign. And here you can see what it looks like after sanding those letters a little bit. And here's what the back looks like and also the sides after I've sanded that paper. It gives it a really nice weathered look. I used 2 of these little wood carrots from the Dollar Tree, and I'm just painting them. I believe it's spiced carrot from Apple Barrel Paints, and then I use a green color to do the top. And now I'm going in to paint in a little bit of detail with, I think I added some red to that spiced carrot just to give me a darker orange color to put some lines in the carrot. I'm pretty sure I end up covering that with some splatter paint anyway. I glue 1 carrot on each side of the sign. I'm using 3 of these wood bunny heads from the Dollar Tree. You can see the edges are really rough, which works great for this rustic project, but I did go over them with some fine grit sanding paper just to smooth them a little bit. For my white chocolate bunny, I'm using Waverly chalk paint in the color Ivory. For the milk chocolate bunny, I'm using nutmeg brown from Apple Barrel Paints. And for my dark chocolate bunny, I'm using melted chocolate from Apple Barrel Paints. I sanded the front and back as well as all of the edges of the bunny head to give them a more rustic look. I'm using the twine from these Dollar Tree ornaments because they're a thinner twine and I thought they would be perfect as bunny whiskers. So I'm just cutting them to size. I also use those little hearts are from the coffee stir sticks from Dollar Tree. I just broke off the hearts off the end and repainted them. And those will be my bunny noses. And I'm just trimming my whiskers. You can see that I've already painted in the ears a little bit with light pink. I've also added some bows that I had made ahead of time and decided to use them for this project, but I end up changing that. I'm going to use some black beads for the eyes. These are the same beads that I used in my last video for the gingerbread, and they just happen to be the perfect size for this bunny project. And I did this project before I had Fabri-Tac glue, so I'm using some of that super glue from Dollar Tree just to attach the beads. And I'm gluing the eyes so that one is a little bit higher than the other, just to give it a more whimsical look. Here you can see some of the sanding that I've done on the face. This is where I changed my mind about the bows that I had attached. I took some of the buttons and that extra baker's twine that I had. So I just have a couple of pieces of twine made into a simple bow. And then I just took some ribbon, made a simple bow, and glued that on top of the twine. Painting in a little line under the nose. And in order to get a nice fine line, I just watered down some black paint. You could also use an ultrafine Sharpie marker. And I just make a little dot with a stylus at the bottom of that line. I use an ultrafine Sharpie marker just to add some detail around the perimeter of the sign. If you've watched my other projects, you know how much I like to do the lines and squiggles and dots. It really does add a lot to the detail of the project and really makes things stand out. So I'm just doing a real imperfect wiggly line. Sometimes I put dots in between or little cross hatches. For this, I am just doing a squiggly line. And then I decide to go ahead and do that around all of the bunny heads as well. If you're enjoying this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel, and share it with your crafty friends. I'm using an X-Acto knife to separate the fibers of the twine for the whiskers. I originally planned on using little eye hooks to attach the bunny heads, which you'll see here, they're kind of hanging from that, but I decided I didn't like that, so I took it off. I ended up changing my mind again, so I have three different ways of how you can attach these. You can see I've added some splatter paint to my bunny heads with the ivory and black paint. And now for my second try, I decided to use some craft sticks. So I just painted three different craft sticks and the colors to match the bunny. And I end up gluing them to the back of the bunny head and then to the back of the sign so that they're sticking up above the sign. But I end up drilling some holes in the top of that sign as well as in the bottom of the bunny head and inserting some dowels into the sign. And then I'm just gluing my bunny head onto the sign. Here's a final look at the project. I really do love everything about this sign. I love the idea of three different chocolate bunnies, and I like the rustic look of it using the splatter paint. I think it turned out really nice. For project number two, I'm using another tabletop sign from the Dollar Tree, and I've just taken off all of the paper and I painted it with truffle from Waverly chalk paint. And on this one, I'm also painting the front of the sign using the ivory chalk paint. To keep the rustic look of the sign, I do some light feathering with the ivory paint over the truffle paint. I don't want to have any clean, crisp lines between the two colors. I bought some wood letters from Walmart, but I didn't want to use them on the sign. I wanted to paint the letters in and sand over them to give it that more rustic look. So I'm just tracing the letters onto my sign. I watered down some black paint and I'm just going to paint in all of the letters. This is before I had a Posca paint pen, which I highly recommend. It would have gone a lot faster if I had the pen. After painting all of the letters, I give it a light sanding and then I do some splattering of paint using black and truffle. I'm using these carrot ornaments from the Dollar Tree, and I'm just putting some Mod Podge on the back, and I will be using scrapbook paper to decorate the fronts of these rather than paint them. So I'm just making sure I have a nice thin layer of Mod Podge on the back side of the carrot. Now, don't do what I did, which you'll see in a second. I covered the wrong side of the carrot with the scrapbook paper. Some of these ornaments do have a stamp on them, and I don't want that to show up. I do use Waverly Antique Wax watered down to stain the backs of these carrots, so unfortunately I couldn't use this one because of that stamp. You can see I've used two different kinds of scrapbook paper, and now you can also see how I've stained the back of the carrot. And I'm just going to glue some twine to the back and wrap it around the carrot a few times right at the base of the stem. And you can see why I hate using hot glue, that mess right there on the table. Again, this was before I had Fabri-Tac in my hand, so I would have used Fabri-Tac glue for this project. I have two strands of twine, two or three strands of twine that I made a little bow, and I used two different color square buttons to glue to the front of the bow. I've also sanded along the edges of that scrapbook paper just to give them a more rustic look. I go in with my ultrafine Sharpie and I'm just doing my squiggles and dots along the outside of the carrot. And I really think this makes it stand out nicely. I bought that orange gingham pattern scrapbook paper from either Joann's or Hobby Lobby, and I had the green scrapbook paper in my stash. Here you can see what a difference the Sharpie marker details make. I use 5 carat ornaments for this project. I've measured out on the sign where I want them to be so they are all centered on the sign properly. And I'm just using a nail to get that hole started because I'm going to put some eye screws into the wood to hang the carrots from. And this MDF board is just too hard to get my eye screw in, so I just have to get it started with a little hole. I'm going to glue a little hanger on the back of the carrot, and I just use those little twine hangers that came with it, and I just glue those onto the carrot, and I make sure my outside carrots have the shorter twine, and then they gradually go down into somewhat of a V-shaped pattern, which you'll see what I'm trying to explain in a minute, so that the center carrot hangs lower and the next tier is a little higher, and then the two outside carrots are the highest to the sign. here it is finished. I'm just making sure that I have the right length of twine on each one so that they're hanging properly. And here's the finished project. You can see I did do the splatter paint using black paint. You can also see where I sanded the letters, giving it that nice rustic look. I love the detail of the Sharpie marker on the carrots. This is a really nice piece to fit in with your farmhouse decor and can be used all year round. For project number 3, I'm using this ugly sign that I bought at a thrift store, and I'm just going to paint the front of it using Waverly chalk paint in the color ivory again, and I do paint the outside of the frame using truffle. It did take a couple of coats to cover up the sign. And off camera, I did sand all of the edges as well as the front and sides of all of the pieces just to give them a nice weathered look. I'm dry brushing that truffle on by putting a little bit of paint on the brush and then wiping most of it off, and then just lightly going over the front of the sign. I'm using that scrapbook paper from Hobby Lobby, and I do end up using 3 different colors of the same paper. I've stained all of the bunny heads using antique wax, watered down. So I'm just going over, pressing along the edges because of that beveled edge. I'm just going along the edge of the bunny head to make an impression in the paper so that I know where to cut. I do also cut the paper to go on the back of the sign. I did have a different idea in mind for this project originally, but I end up changing that so you only need to put the scrapbook paper on the front side. You can use scissors or sandpaper to rough up the edges of the paper. Off camera, I went over all of the paper with some fine grit sanding paper just to give it a more distressed look. I'm using Mod Podge to glue on all of the papers. You don't want to have any air bubbles. That really, in my opinion, that really ruins the look of the piece. So I'm just really making sure that all of the air bubbles are out and I have it pressed down firmly. Here's what it looks like with the scrapbook paper. Jumping ahead a little bit, you can see that I've added some bows. I just used some of the burlap lace ribbon from the Dollar Tree cut two pieces and put it in an X shape, glued that to the head. Then I made some raffia bows and I glued that on top of it. And then I finished off by using some of those square buttons that I had in my stash. I also used the coffee stir sticks for the heart on the end, and I used those as my bunny noses. I just repainted them. And I'm using some white baker's twine for the whiskers. I used those same black beads for the eyes. I cut off a small part of the bottom of the bunny head with that other project in mind, so you don't have to do that for this project. I apply some pink chalk with a fluffy brush to add cheeks and the inner ears. I ended up going back over the area by applying the chalk with a Q-tip to deepen up the shade a bit. You'll see that at the end of the project. I like the look of the scrapbook paper after it's been sanded. I think that really adds a lot to the rustic look of this piece. I really like this wood grain scrapbook paper from Hobby Lobby. It can be used for a variety of different rustic farmhouse projects. I make some final adjustments to make sure that the bunny heads are placed evenly on the sign, and I use some wood glue to attach them. I did add some splatter paint using truffle and black paint. I have a lot more spring and Easter craft projects as well as crochet projects coming up. So please don't forget to subscribe to my channel and hit that notification bell so that you don't miss out on my upcoming videos. Here's a look at the final project. I think it turned out super sweet and I hope you guys like it. Please let me know in the comments which project was your favorite. Thank you so much for watching and I'll see you in my next video.